My name is Michael Donnelly, P.E. I'm a structural engineer with 14 years of experience. I get involved mostly with the design of steel-framed fireproof buildings. I've worked on public and private projects. I'm currently working on a building stabilization project in Jersey City. Past projects have included a project for the DEP in Queens, New York, which involved over 1,500 tons of steel framing, where I was responsible for the review of shop drawings, fabrication drawings. I'm a principal of Donnelly Engineering Group here in Hackensack. On September 11, 2001, I was working in a small engineering design office, and when news came that the towers had been hit by an airplane, we put on the television and proceeded to watch like the rest of the country did. And I never suspected that the towers were going to collapse. None of us in that room, none of the experienced engineers that I work with, made a comment that, wow, I think those towers are going to come down. None of us had the intuition that we rely on. None of us felt that that was going to happen. And really, for months after that, I felt like my engineering judgment was called into question. Why didn't I realize that was going to happen? About 2 years later, I had a friend that asked me if it was possible for the Twin Towers to achieve near free fall speed when they collapsed. And I thought about that. I mean, I have a physics background, certainly even from college and high school, advanced courses in my engineering curriculum. That made me think, and it led me into doing my own research into the FEMA report, the 9/11 Commission report, finally the NIST report. And I went through those reports exhaustively. I wanted to know what happened. You know, my country was attacked. I'm a structural engineer, and I want to know the facts. So I did my own research and quickly realized that, you know, my judgment wasn't suspect, that the tower should not have collapsed. And that, you know, that reassured me that, you know, my own ability was called into question. And then I realized that, you know, those towers shouldn't have collapsed on 9/11. Yeah, and there were a lot of reasons we didn't think the towers were going to collapse. And we weren't alone. You know, the chiefs of the FDNY sent their men into those buildings because they didn't suspect those buildings would collapse. We've never had a steel-framed skyscraper collapse in the United States or internationally. So, you know, there's no precedent. No one had that experience to draw on. So, you know, and further, the towers were designed for an airplane impact. You know, that was well known. They were redundant. You know, you have a central core of columns that were massive, and the outside core of columns were numerous and could withstand that type of an impact because even if some columns failed, there were remaining columns that the load would be redistributed to. So really, there was no reason we would think that that would happen. With regard to Building 7, Building 7 was a 47-story skyscraper. Would have been the largest skyscraper had it been built in 33 other states. And Building 7 was not hit by an airplane. Yet it came down later in the day, apparently due to small fires spread throughout the building, and fell into its own footprint at near free fall acceleration. This is the smoking gun of 9/11. I don't think Building 7 could have collapsed by fire. You know, as NIST tells us that fires within the building caused thermal expansion, which led to this so-called progression of collapse. If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse. We may have seen, you know, the buildings actually topple over to one side, certainly not fall in its own footprint. I don't believe that NIST's explanation that thermal expansion led to the collapse of Building 7 is believable. I don't believe it's based on any scientific evidence. It's merely a theory that NIST has sort of worked into their model that they developed, their computer simulation of how the building collapsed. It's not based on any forensic evidence. It's not based on eyewitness testimony. I have studied their report. I understand the framing system of the building. Steel beams framing into a girder. Both the girder and the beams have shear studs, which allow the framing to act compositely with the structural concrete floor slabs. In my opinion, thermal expansion would have been resisted by that concrete slab floor. NIST excluded certain details of that collapse mechanism to suit their model. They left out the fact that the steel framing and the concrete would have heated up together. They assumed that the steel framing heated up independently of the concrete floor slab, which they say contributed to the shearing of those studs that connect the steel beams to the concrete floor. So clearly NIST has manipulated the facts as they present them to their advantage, to the advantage of this simulation, to get the result that they wanted. I mean, they're a federal agency. They rely on the federal government for their funding. Clearly, they're not an unbiased group of so-called scientists. They have people to answer to, and they certainly prove that with this faulty, fraudulent investigation. You know, NIST's theory that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building in a matter of seconds, clearly does not support the evidence. We've got a building that came down in its own footprint, so all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time in order for that structure to fall the way that we saw. And NIST's collapse mechanism progresses up through and outward. There's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed. Another thing to consider is the sheer number of connections between beams and columns and beams and girders. I would think we'd be looking at thousands of connections throughout the building that would have had to have given way at the same time or nearly instantaneously in order to get the collapse that we saw. With regard to the Twin Towers, as far as the collapse, the pancaking of the floors, the so-called pancaking of the floors, considering the height of the buildings, if we had had a natural gravity collapse, we may have seen the core columns remaining and then toppling over. But what we see is the entire building collapsing together. We see the exterior columns collapsing with the floors, collapsing with the interior columns, all at the same time, and that just defies logic. And you know, you don't have to be a structural engineer to see that. You can be anyone in the construction field with some knowledge of how buildings are put together. We have, you know, demolition experts that clearly see that the official story just doesn't add up. A major inconsistency that we find with the collapse of the Twin Towers is really the debris pile that we observe at the footprint of the towers is really inconsistent with the reports put out by the government. What we see is really the spread of debris in a large radius around each tower, approximately 1,400 feet. And with a natural gravity collapse, as the government purports, we would expect to see floors at the bottom of these collapses. We would expect to see debris piled up within the footprints of each building, but we don't see that. What we see is an outward explosion of material beyond the perimeters of each footprint. And this is not expected, and it's not congruent with the reports of our government. And this is one of the main reasons I think we need a new investigation. There are a number of inconsistencies we find with the initiation of collapse in the North Tower, which directly contradict NIST's explanation. We see really a rapid collapse with very little resistance, which we would not expect. I mean, we can see this in the video footage. There's another point I'd like to make with regard to the initiation of collapse within the North Tower. NIST and FEMA reports that this pancake collapse started with sagging floors that led to buckling of the exterior columns. We would expect to see a very natural progression of collapse, but we don't see that. About the upper 12 floors, we see almost an immediate symmetrical collapse, which is completely unnatural and not expected for a gravitational collapse, as we're told. So what we see with the South Tower is completely inconsistent with the official story. We see a large 30-story block of the building rotating and tilting outward, while the bottom remaining portion of the building collapses vertically from top down. This is not explained by any natural phenomenon. It's not explained by gravity. It's certainly not a gravitational collapse. I think what we see is a removal of key columns that allowed the upper section of the building to fail, to drop, and then some other type of explosives that started to bring the rest of the building down below it. Clearly, the evidence shows that this is not a natural collapse, and the evidence points to controlled demolition. And a new investigation is needed, damn it.